This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So there will be a few poems, so you've been warned. Thanks, Chandradeepa. It was a real delight and a privilege to support that course. It was very inspiring. It was very inspiring. Speaking of the word inspiring and inspiration, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've been asking myself, what do we mean when we use that word? Because we use that word a lot. Inspiration or inspiring or inspire. It comes up again and again and again and again in our Buddhist community. I have to confess, sometimes I wish we had another word. After I've been involved in Triratna for 27 years, and sometimes I wish there was some new words that we could use for certain things, But I've actually, having thought about the word and done a bit of digging into it, I think it's a really, really good word, and it's got depth and it's got richness, as hopefully we'll see. And I've looked in the thesaurus for alternatives, and there aren't any really good alternatives, I think. Actually, I think inspiration is actually a really, really excellent word. So, an excellent word for, what it signifies, because what I've been interested in, what does it signify? Because we use words to signify particular experiences, and if you delve into the word, you can delve into the experience, which is why words are really interesting. I've become more and more interested in words. Recently, I got the Oxford English Dictionary app for my phone, and it's just fantastic. I love it. And that might make me a swot, and if I am, I make no apologies, because looking things up in the dictionary is not just an exercise in pedantry. When we delve into the meaning of words, we do delve into the texture of human experience. And the more we understand where words come from, the deeper and the more fine-grained our understanding of our experience is. And Buddhism is nothing if it's not a path to understand human experience in the deepest possible way. So the meaning of words and the origins of words are really, really fascinating. Incidentally, it's one of the things that bodhisattvas excel in. It's one of the pratisambhas, which is the analytical meanings or analytical knowledges, I think they are. I'm talking off the top of my head here, I didn't look this up. But one of them is the analytical knowledge of words. I can see Vajratara nodding. Thanks, Vajratara. So, words are... well, we're going to have a whole lot of words tonight, so anyway. Words about words. Anyway, so I'm going to give you a bit of a dictionary definition. I'm not going to give you the whole dictionary definition of inspiration from the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm just going to give you, 2.5. There are others, but so the first meaning of the word inspiration is the drawing in of breath or inhalation. In English, we don't use this word very often, actually, hardly at all, for that. In other languages, that word is used, expression and inspiration, I think. Where's Juliano? Is that correct? Yeah, thanks. And the other sense of the word, which is the sense that we're using it for the purposes of this talk, is the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially to do something creative. So the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially to do something creative. For example, Helen had one of her flashes of inspiration. Or, that's one of the examples that the Oxford Dictionary gives. Or get this, the Malvern Hills have provided inspiration for many artists. That's what it actually says, interestingly enough. For those of you who are not from this part of the world, the Malvern Hills are those hills you see just over there on the horizon. And divine influence, especially that supposed to have led to the writing of the Bible. So I'll come back to that a bit later on. So I just want to focus on that first one for a while. So the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially to do something creative. So that's what we mean when we say inspiration. And I think we really do mean that, actually. I think it's actually a pretty apt definition. Because, of course, as we heard a couple of days ago from Vajrashura, that Dharma practice is about making the transition from the reactive mind to the creative mind, and from a creative mind to an ever more creative mind. So it's as if inspiration is what sets that process in motion. It animates our Dharma life. It animates that process of moving from reactive to creative and ever more creative. Without it, we'll dry up. So it's got lots of qualities. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just asked myself, what are the qualities of inspiration? When we're inspired, how do we know that we're inspired? So there's confidence. We often feel confident. We often feel or have a clarity of purpose. We know who we are and what we're doing. Often there's an accompanying sense of possibility. We feel things are possible that maybe were unknown to us before or felt impossible. And then there's joy. Often with inspiration just comes a feeling of joy and delight. We feel energized. There's often with inspiration a sense of freshness or newness, as if we've encountered something that we haven't known before and it's fresh. Significantly, the bodhisattvas appear as youthful beings. They're fresh, they haven't aged yet. They've got in that first flush of youth to indicate that the Dharma is always new. It never ages, it never sullies or tires. And of course, there's an intimation of freedom. So when we're inspired, there's an intimation of freedom or a taste of freedom. And so those are some qualities of inspiration. I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list. You might like to ask yourself that question yourself, like, how do I know that I'm inspired? You know, when I feel inspired, what does that mean? What's happening? What are the sources of that? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about sources of inspiration. I don't want to talk in detail about that because hopefully you'll think about it yourself. But if you remember to the very first night, I can't exactly remember what the questions were, but Chandradeepa asked us to ask each other or tell each other some moments when we've been inspired. What I noticed myself is that when I did that, I felt inspired. Recalling inspiration is itself inspiring. So that probably repays a lot of consideration, a lot of thought, you know. Remembering when you're inspired and, crucially, telling somebody else about it is inspiring. It's inspiring for you and it's likely going to be inspiring for them too. So sources of inspiration, of course, there's the Dharma, there's the teachings, the ideas, the books, the talks, the sutras, and so on. And there's images. The Dharma is replete with images. There's the refuge tree over there, for example. Very inspiring image. There's practices, there's meditation, there's puja, there's Dharma study, there's collective projects. There's aesthetic experience, through the arts. There's music and literature and visual art and theatre and cinema and opera and poetry and the whole range. There's so many of them, and no doubt you've got your favourite one. There's nature, being in nature, just being the last few days have been absolutely glorious, really, in terms of just the texture of the cool air and the beauty of the setting sun, the crystals of ice and all of that. So beauty, of course, is inspiring. And of course there's people, communication with other people, there's friendship, there's one's local sangha, there's, being inspired by people we know and people we don't know. Maybe we're inspired by people who lived hundreds of years ago. or people that live now that we've not come in personal contact with, but who we've met through their creative expressions. And then, of course, there's the enlightened one. So he's a person, but he's a very special kind of person. We'll visit him again a little bit later on. So that's just a very broad kind of broad brushstrokes over qualities of inspiration and sources of inspiration. What I want to do now is make some kind of what I suppose you could call general observations about the experience of inspiration. So I've got a few points actually. So the first thing is, and this is very much akin to what Vajratara was saying last night, and that is that like all things, it arises in dependence on conditions. So we need inspiration to get on with our Dharma life, and for inspiration to arise, we need to get on. So inspiration is both it propels our Dharma life, but in order to have it, we also need to make effort for it to arise. And part of what that means, I think, is we need to understand how we become inspired. How do you become inspired? What are the conditions that lead to that in your life? And knowing what does that is really helpful self-knowledge. If you know that, you're well on your way, I think, if you know what inspires you. And what's curious about this is what you find inspiring might be slightly different or even quite different from what somebody else finds inspiring. It's one of the wonderful things, actually, about human life is there's such a range of responses and temperaments. Just while I'm on the topic, it's one of the wonderful things about our Buddhist community. There's such a range of temperaments and responses, and yet we're all part of the same thing. So it's really important, to know what inspires you, and not just that, but to follow the thread. So to follow up your inspirations, to delve more deeply into them. If something inspires you, go into that. And then what usually happens, I think, is that something that inspires you will arise and connected with the first thing. So you kind of follow this kind of pattern, like a tapestry of inspirations. And crucially, and we talked a little bit about responsibility earlier. Those of you who are in the groups and pioneers, we had a panel discussion, myself and Vajratara and Vajrashura were talking about just the experience of, practicing the path of responsibility. And one of the things that Bhante said, which is oft quoted, he was talking to some chairs many moons ago, and he talked in terms of guarding your sources of inspiration. Guard them was the language that he used. And this put me in mind of a verse from the first chapter, or two verses from the first chapter of the Dhammapada, which I think are relevant here. So what the Buddha says is, this, I'll just read it. Those who regard non-essence as essence and see essence as non-essence don't get to the essence, ranging about in wrong resolves. But those who know essence as essence and non-essence as non-essence get to the essence, ranging about in right resolves. So essence, a way you could understand it is knowing what's essential and knowing what's not essential. And it's great, the Dhammapada. It just gets right, it just cuts right to the chase. There's no fluff. And it's quite, frankly, I find it quite blunt. There's no sort of mollycoddling. The Buddha just gives it to you. So basically what he's saying is choose what's essential and pursue it, and don't pursue what's not essential. I mean, that sounds really obvious, doesn't it? But so often we just don't make time and space for those things that we know are essential. So I think commitment means deciding what's essential and deciding what's not essential, and making sure that we do what's essential and what is not, and not doing what's not essential. It's so obvious, isn't it? But often we prevaricate, we don't want to make up our minds. So we need to distinguish, and we need to pursue. And that means making time and making space for what's essential. So I was thinking about a shrine. A shrine it exists concretely in space. So when you have a shrine, when you build a shrine in a room, like this room, it's really obvious what's essential when you come in here, isn't it? It's the Buddha and Guru Padmasambhava and Bhante and offerings and all these other rupas which signify all our centres all around the movement. That's what this room is about. It's really, really clear. And I think sometimes we also need to do that in terms of our life, in terms of our time. I think it's quite helpful to think of time in a kind of spatial way, almost as a mandala. So what do we do with our day? What parts of our day do we focus on and give ourselves completely over to what we find inspiring? How do we do that? Bhante seems to be suggesting that we really, really have to do that, particularly if we're going to take considerable responsibility. It's essential to do that. It's essential to do what's essential. Anyway, enough on that. I do want to make one point about that, and that is that for some people, guarding your sources of inspiration might mean doing things on your own. But it doesn't only mean that, actually. I think sometimes when we talk about inspiration, it's if you kind of go away and you be inspired, and then you come back and you engage. But for some people, your sources of inspiration might be something that you do with others. I was thinking about I'm actually an introvert. I think I'm fairly well introverted, actually. But one of the things I find really inspiring is the Mitra study group I do on a Monday night. It's really, really wonderful. So that's a source of inspiration for me. Anyway, I just thought I'd make that point, because I think sometimes we can think of it all as something sort of private, but it doesn't necessarily, might not be that for you at all. And if it isn't, well, fine. It's just what is it that inspires you? That's my first point, really. Is it arises in dependence on conditions. So make the conditions for it to arise. The second thing I want to say is don't assume you already know where it's going to come from. So don't assume you already know where inspiration is going to come from. Keep on the lookout. So I think if you develop a kind of a poetic sensibility where you're really sensitive to your environment, and if you're really sensitive to your environment, which you will be if you practice the Dharma, actually, you notice things that are inspiring, and take it wherever it comes. Like, sometimes it's surprising. Before Christmas, a friend of mine gave myself and my husband tickets to the Gate Theatre, which is one of the main theatres in Dublin, and what was on was Peter Pan. I never would have gone to it. It's sort of like a pseudo-pantomime. And it was the story of Peter Pan. It was reinterpreted by Roddy Doyle. Some of you will know him. He wrote the Snapper and the Commitments, the novels that were made into those films. He's quite very well-known, actually, Irish writer. Anyway, it was set in Dublin, so they all had Dublin accents. It was really great, actually. But there's this scene. Those of you who know the story of Peter Pan, if you're not from England, it's a very, very famous English story. There's these kids, and they fly to Never Never Land. It's really wonderful. There's Tinkerbell and there's Peter Pan, and Peter Pan takes fairy dust out of his pocket, blows it on the kids, and they're able to fly. And they did this wonderful thing where they had, that thing where someone's on their back and they've got their feet in the air and you can put them on somebody else's belly and you can kind of do that. And they did that, and I started crying. Now, I don't actually cry very easily, but oh my God, I'm crying. That's really weird. It really took me by surprise. My most inspiring dreams are the ones where I fly. It's like, oh, I can fly. Oh, you know that thing? It's wonderful. So it was like that, and somehow it just touched me. True to the advice I've given you, I went out and I bought the book. I thought I'm going to follow this up. It's very, very odd. And there was something else that happened in it where it made me cry as well. Afterwards, I remember, I'm actually telling you all this, but I remember saying to Pavra, I said, don't tell anybody about it. I really don't cry that easily. Except, no, Vajashura, just hold your tongue. He knows me too well. Anyway, so the point of that is, you don't know where it's going to come from. You don't know who it's going to come from. Remember when I was a kid, there was this thing called the Desiderata. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It was very popular in the 60s and 70s. It was supposed to be written in 1692, but apparently it was written in like 1927. I didn't know that when I was a kid, but one of the lines in it, which actually stuck in my head, my mother had it on the back of the kitchen door. Listen to others, even the dull and ignorant, they too have their story. That's what it said. It sort of stuck in my head. And sometimes, we were talking about this in our group earlier, you never know where something inspiring is going to come from. But often we're like, no, I am inspired by Buddhism. And it's like we've got our blinkers on. Or I'm inspired by certain people who give talks and we don't pay attention to anybody else. But it's amazing. It's inspiration all over the place if you're sensitive to it. So don't assume you already know where it's going to come from. Another general observation, what inspires you can change over time. This is one of the challenging things about the Dharma life, I think, is that you could be really inspired by something and you go along really, really happily and really, really well, and then all of a sudden it's not inspiring anymore. Or something else is inspiring. So it just happened to me a few years ago. So as Chandradeepa mentioned earlier, when I was ordained, I took up a visualization practice. I've sometimes been a bit circumspect about being open about this, but then it occurred to me that Bhante was quite open about it. So I was given the Padmasambhava practice by my preceptor, and I did that very, very happily for 15 years, very regularly, and I absolutely loved it and found it very inspiring. And then, and I always found Padmasambhava inspiring. I remember the very, very first time I heard about him was I was visiting a Tibetan Buddhist centre in just outside of Auckland in New Zealand, and the man I was with, who was a friend of my sister's, told me all about Guru Rinpoche, who took Buddhism to Tibet, and I was like, wow, because I see him in the sky, it's like, and one of the, and so, you get involved in Sri Ratna, you probably in other Buddhist communities, and you hear about all these amazing figures, Avalokiteshvara and Manjughosha and Rothful Vajrapani and all these figures, and Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite love, and Green Tara, and I was like, oh yeah, and Tara was one. I was like, oh, Tara, yeah, sounds good. And then, who's next? I had absolutely no response to Tara at all. And if you told me, in 25 years, you're going to do that in practice every single day, I never would have believed you. But that's what happened. And it happened when Bhante died. It was very, very strange. It was like Green Tara just kind of got released into the ether. It's a very, very odd experience. So it's anyway. That's just a personal story, really, of something happening in my Dharma life that I never could have envisaged, I never could have predicted, and because I wasn't interested in Tara at all. I mean, other than just a sort of a general knowledge and attraction, but nothing beyond that. So it's very strange. She's green. It's actually. Yeah, it's quite strange. Green, so a green, yeah. It's actually a serious point. Maybe there's something to do with Peter Pan in there, I don't know. Because he's green too. So yeah, it's what you find inspiring. It's not that I don't find Padmasambhava inspiring at all. Actually, I almost feel like Green Tara is a practice that's been given to me by him. Anyway, don't be too quick to explain our deepest inspiration. Don't be too quick to explain our deepest inspiration. So I think the most inspiring things elude easy analysis. So recently I was reading an article about Werner Herzog. So some of you might have heard of him. He's a Bavarian filmmaker. I think he probably started making films in the late 60s or early 70s. And he's been making films ever since. And in the early 80s, he made this film called Fitzcarraldo, which is about an Irishman who goes and wants to open a opera house in the Amazonian jungle. It's a very strange story. And there's this timeless image in it, which is they've got this 360-ton steamboat which they're cruising up this river, and they need to get through these rapids. They can't get through the rapids, so they take the steamboat over a hill. It's the most outlandish thing. So there's this incredible image of this steamboat on an angle like this, going up a hill with smoke coming out of the smokestack, like this up a hill. It's an incredible image if you've seen the film. I mean, it's outlandish but incredible. And one of the things about Herzog is he absolutely refused to interpret his films, and he hated psychoanalysis. In his view, it was the source. Freud was the source of all the evils of the 20th century. He's very, very strong about it. And what he said, there's actually a film about the film, which is as interesting as the film itself, actually, and really quite extreme. I'm not recommending emulating Herzog, but he's a very interesting man. What he says, he was asked about this metaphor of the boat, and he says, it's a great metaphor. For what? I don't know to this day, but it's a great metaphor. So this is typical of him. It's like sometimes things just mean something, and you can't say why, but that doesn't mean that they don't mean something. I think there's a real modern tendency to need to catch everything with words and concepts. And that's when words and concepts are a bit of a problem, actually. It's when we can't just sit in the mysterious. And actually, this helped me understand, when I think about this, helped me understand one of the things that I've noticed about this Green Tara thing that I have is I don't want to know anything about Green Tara, other than what she looks like and what the practice is. And I only just realised that when I was giving this talk, actually, or preparing this talk. I've got a big fat book I was given a big fat book about Tara, and I think I should read that, because that's usually what I do. If I get interested in something, I read about it. But I don't want to read about her, actually. So this occurred to me because I was thinking about giving this talk. And I mean, this is akin to what we were talking about earlier, myself and Vajrashira and Vajratara, that when you have to do something for other people, it drives your own sort of reflection deeper. So, that was actually a really helpful insight, that it's okay not to know lots about. I don't have to know lots about Tara, actually. I know all that I need to know. So when you have to share, sometimes it helps you go deeper. And this also put me in mind of thinking about Keats. So Keats is a British romantic poet. He died when he was 25. I mean, it's really incredible what he achieved in a short life. This is the sort of thing that I find inspiring. You might not find it inspiring, and that's absolutely fine. So, you know, if you're a true Ratna Buddhist, you don't have to like Keats. That's really, that's quite a serious point, actually. He's not everyone's cup of tea. But what he says, he's got this concept called negative capability. So this is what he says about it in a letter to a friend. He says, "And at once it struck me So he's talking about a conversation. He's recounting a conversation that he had with somebody else to his brothers in a letter. This is what he says in the letter. And at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's great, isn't it? I mean, it's really fascinating because it's very, very famous, that concept, negative capability, in literature, but in other fields as well. And it's just, that's it. It's a little line in a letter. But he catches so much in those words. I'll just read it again. And at once it struck me. So the light goes on. He's having a conversation and he realizes something in the process of having the conversation. And at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So it's as if Keats is saying, just to be able to stay in that space where you don't know, and not to try and bring it down to something that you do know, is what he was trying to do in his poetic endeavour. And I'm sure that's what we're trying to do in our endeavour. Because when you dig deeply into the Dharma, when you dig deeply into meditation, when you dig really deeply into friendship, you get to a point where you just don't know what's happening anymore. Sometimes I feel like that's what we're trying to do with Dharma life, is just get there and stay there as much as we can. So that's all about don't be too quick to explain our deepest inspiration. The next point, a general observation about inspiration. Test our inspiration against the touchstone of right view. So when we're moved by something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Sometimes, I mentioned earlier, shedding tears. Sometimes shedding tears is profound, and sometimes it's a helpful emotional release, and that's it. It's not necessarily something you should base your life on, but it might be. Do you sort of see what I mean? That just being moved by something isn't enough to base your life on. It needs some kind of critical thought as well. Critical thought in the best sense. I think actually genuine critical thought helps us into that experience of awe that Keats was describing, actually. So we can ask, is this really good? Is this really true? Does this accord this understanding with Buddhist teaching? I'll give an example of what I mean. So a number of years ago, well, I suppose it's quite a few years ago now, when he was president, Obama came to Ireland and he gave a speech. And I watched it. I don't quite remember why I watched it, because I'm not in the habit of watching political speeches, but I watched it. I actually can't remember if I watched. He gave it right outside Trinity College in the middle of Dublin, if I remember rightly, and I might have even been there. I can't remember, or maybe I watched it on video. I can't remember. But what was really weird was as I was listening to him talking, I found myself being moved. I found myself getting kind of emotional. And I didn't trust it. I thought, he's manipulating me. It's like, I felt like he was doing some kind of magical rite, of a kind of a rite of fascination, and a mundane rite of fascination. It wasn't the rite of fascination that we used to talk about in our Buddhist community. I'm not saying he's a bad man, but I knew that I couldn't trust that. I knew that I couldn't trust that. I knew that it's like he was able to turn something on in my brain and make me feel emotional. It was a really weird experience. And it gave me pause afterwards. It's like you could turn this being moved button on somehow, the way that he was speaking. It's really, I mean, in a way I kind of admired him for it, but I kind of thought at the same time, I just knew that I couldn't trust it. It's not something to base your life on, just being moved by a politician giving a speech. So there needs to be some kind of critical analysis in the best sense of asking, is this actually really a good way to live my life? What he's encouraging me to do. Has he really got a message? And it wasn't what he was saying was awful, but it wasn't. They weren't my values. Here we go. So my next point is stay faithful to your inspiration, even when you don't feel inspired. So I know I'm being a bit paradoxical here. Stay faithful to your inspiration, even when you don't feel inspired. Because there's something deeper at work, which I feel I can only really call faith. So I use that word advisedly, which means I use it consciously and deliberately. Faith is a word that we use in the Dharma to translate a Sanskrit word, shraddha or Pali saddha, and it means something like to place the heart upon. Or this is what Subhuti says, faith is the mind's natural responsiveness to higher values, to what is good and admirable. That's what Subhuti says about it. And it's a natural capacity of the human heart and mind. A little aphorism of Bante's is faith innate, doubt acquired. Faith innate, doubt acquired. I really love that. It's one of those things you think, something to go away and think about. There's a wonderful exploration of faith that comes from the Abhidharma tradition. Bante goes into it in Know Your Mind, his book Know Your Mind, which is based on a seminar. And Subhuti's kind of expressed that material, some of it, and added his own stuff in a book called Mind and Harmony, which is, they're both excellent books. I think Mind and Harmony is a bit more user-friendly, but there's some absolutely cracking stuff in there. It's actually, I would say it's essential. It really helps you understand. Well, I talked earlier about how words correspond to experience, and what the Abhidharma does is it goes into that in really fine-grained analysis, particularly in terms of what are skillful mental states and what are unskillful mental states, and you can really be sure that you can get about as close as you can to analysing them with words. It's brilliant stuff. Anyway, that's a slight aside. So according to this, there are 3 dimensions or aspects of faith. There's faith in realities, or deep faith. There's faith in qualities, or lucid faith. And there's faith in capacities, or longing faith. So the first one is faith in realities, or deep faith. And this is that faith which is able to perceive truth. This thing when you hear the Dharma being articulated and somehow you know that it's true. You think, without thinking about it, this is true. Somehow you know. It's almost like something you almost knew already but had never heard articulated. You know that kind of experience? I remember the first time I heard a talk by Sangharakshita in 1996. It wasn't a very easy first talk. It was the depth psychology of the Yogacara. And I didn't really know what he was talking about, but I knew he was talking about something really, really important and I wanted to know more. I knew that there was some truth in it. And sometimes I think why this is important is, it's important for a lot of reasons. Just because you can't explain that to somebody else doesn't mean that it's not real for you. Sometimes you just have faith in the Dharma and you can't quite explain it. And sometimes somebody else might not have that faith and you feel a bit crestfallen because you can't kind of explain it as well as somebody else might be explaining it. But I think obviously one should test one's faith, in the fires of reason. But even if you can't do that, it doesn't mean that it's not genuine, is what I'm trying to say. It's not genuine. And it might not be an experience of delight. So usually when we say that we're inspired, there's an accompanying sense of delight, maybe freedom or opening that comes with it. Sometimes when you hear the Dharma, it's not like that. Actually, it's a little bit like, oh, you know that it's true, but you couldn't say that you felt inspired by it. I was thinking actually, when I first started working with Vajrashura at the Dublin Buddhist Centre, it was actually really quite difficult for a while, for reasons I won't go into. But it wasn't, in a way, it wasn't very inspiring. But I never doubted for a moment that it was worth doing. Do you sort of see what I'm saying? So I think that's why it's important to have this perspective of faith, because sometimes things are inspiring without being inspiring, if you get me. They can be quite uncomfortable, but you know that they're true. And I think probably all of us in our Dharma lives at some point or another will get to the point where we don't feel inspired in the first sense of the word I've been using, but at the same time we need to pursue what we're doing because we know that it's true, we know that it's real, and we know that it's what life's about. So I think that's a really interesting space to get into, and maybe that's something you could discuss in your groups, because probably I think it arises for everybody at some stage. The second so that's faith in realities, or deep faith. The second is faith in qualities. So this is, when you perceive qualities in other people that you have a response to. It's like a visceral experience. And I think what I'm talking about here is trust. I think trust is akin to faith. We trust a person. We might not trust them in every respect, but we see something in their qualities that corresponds to something in us. And the third one is faith in capacities, or longing faith. So this is where we know that we can do it, that we recognise that there's something about this which is to do with me. I can do this because I'm a human being, and because the three jewels are about humanity, I can do this. So I'll just read you a poem. I promised that there'd be a poem. Here's a poem. This is a poem by Sangharakshita. So he wrote this in 1947, so I suppose he would have been 22. That might be significant. So it's called Above Me Broods. Above me broods a world of mysteries and magnitudes. I see, I hear more than what strikes the eye or meets the ear. Within me sleep potencies deep, unfathomably deep, which, when awake, the bonds of life, death, time, and space will break. Infinity, above me like the blue sky do I see. Below, in me, lies the reflection of infinity. So he puts that very well, I think. And coupled with that, so again, this kind of faith is described as longing. It's like we long to bridge that gap between where we are now and those potencies which are lying dormant, he says, which sleep. Within me sleep potencies deep, unfathomably deep. So you want to bring them forth, and I think this is very much akin to metta bhavana. We say traditionally, "May I be free from suffering," and what we're doing there, it's like an expression of a longing. I don't know if sometimes you feel this. You're kind of a longing for the tension and the strain to be gone, Sometimes there's a wonderful puja, I can't remember which puja it is, but there's this great line in it, which is, "May the innate unrest be stilled." Do you ever feel like that? May the innate unrest be stilled. Would all this just stop? That kind of, it's a deep longing, kind of experience. And in a way, it's exacerbated almost when you have an object, when you know that enlightenment is possible, and I use that word know advisedly, you long for it. You long for it for yourself, and you long for it for others. Yeah. So faith, part of the reason I think it's a good word as a translation of Shraddha is it's not merely, often it's translated as confidence or trust, but what faith suggests is something beyond. It suggests the further shore. It suggests something transcendent that weirdly we're kind of in contact with, that we have some affinity for. So that brings us to the second part of our dictionary definition. So the second part of our dictionary definition is divine influence. So inspiration means divine influence, especially that's supposed to have led to the writing of the Bible. And just going into the origin, so this is, of course, inspiration is connected with the word inspire. So this is where the word inspire comes from. It comes from Middle English, which comes from Old French. I'm not going to try and pronounce the words because I'll mangle them. And that comes from Latin. And the Latin word inspirare, I'll probably pronounce that badly, it means breathe or blow into. The word was originally used of a divine or supernatural being in the sense, impart a truth or idea to someone. So I think that's really interesting. So a divine being breathes into, well, here's an example from Genesis. So this is Genesis 2:7, King James Version. I sort of feel like I've got to. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So that's where this idea comes from. Like it's a quickening. Adam is animated by God. Now, you might think, ooh. And if you think that, I have sympathy for that. But this is a kind of notion where the word comes from, and this is one of the really interesting things about being a Western Buddhist, a European Buddhist. I know we're not all European in this room, but in a way I'm not. I'm kind of half am. But the language that we use comes from a theistic tradition. So it's like we have to repurpose these words for our own purposes. I mean, actually, the Buddha did that. He used words from the tradition that he inherited, and he repurposed them. I think we need to do something similar. But yeah, so there's this idea that something transcendent breathes into something and kind of animates it. And last night we heard about the udanas. So the Buddha would sometimes be so moved. Bhante sort of says something like that the pressure in his being becomes so much that he has to give expression. He cannot hold it in, as it were. And that's what they're called the udanas. It's sometimes translated as inspired utterance or a verse of uplift or an exclamation. But what it literally means is an outgoing breath. And not an incoming breath, but an outgoing breath. So you kind of get the idea. So I'll give you an example. Here's one. This is a very, very short little text. Thus I heard. At one time, the Blessed One was staying at Savatthi in Jettiswood at Anathapindika's monastery. Then at that time, the Blessed One was instructing, rousing, enthusing, and cheering the monks with a Dhamma talk connected with emancipation. Those monks, after making it their goal, applying their minds, considering it with all their mind, were listening to Dhamma with an attentive ear. Then the Blessed One, having understood the significance of it, on that occasion uttered this exalted utterance. There is that sphere, monks, where there is no earth, no water, no fire, no air, no sphere of infinite space, no sphere of infinite consciousness, no sphere of no thingness, no sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, no this world, no world beyond, neither moon nor sun. There, monks, I say, there is surely no coming, no going, no persisting, no passing away, no rebirth. It is quite without support, unmoving, without an object. Just this is the end of suffering. So imagine hearing the Buddha say that. That is negative capability. And you can imagine people being, if we read the words without imagining the Buddha saying them, they can sound a little bit like frightening. They probably sound more frightening actually if the Buddha was saying them. It might be that experience of knowing something is true, but being quite, unsettled by it. Because again, sometimes faith can be unsettling. So someone remembers this. Thus have I heard. Ananda remembers it. And we remember what people say, don't we? The Dharma is a communication. It sets a creative train in mind. And it's interesting, so much of what we hear in the Dharma that really means something to us, we hear in conversation. And it's really important to remember that that's how the Dharma that we know, the formulated Dharma, it started in that way. People remembering what other people had said. People obviously remembering what the Buddha had said and repeating it and remembering it and making it part of their life. That's what I love about that Keats thing. Is in a way, it's just a passing bit in a letter, and it's had a massive impact on literature, English literature, massive impact, and other things besides. And a little bit like, you can imagine the Buddha saying something like what he just said, and people really remembering that and telling other people about it. So inspiration, obviously, this is my next point, arises from communication. And if we associate with the Sangha, if we're dry, new inspirations will emerge. That's why it's so important to stay in contact with other people, because they'll interrupt the pattern of our own life. We can get into a pattern, can't we? In the negative sense, a habit. And if we encounter other people, they can break through that. It's so important. It's actually quite disruptive coming on something like this. I don't know if you feel a bit unsettled by coming on this, that's all right, because it is a bit. Because you never know what other people are going to do. You don't know what's going to happen. It disrupts your habit. And in a way, that's a good thing, because the Dharma is a profoundly disruptive agent. It disrupts the status quo profoundly. It disrupts habit. It disrupts patterns. It brings about transformation. So I'm moving into the last little passagey bit. So there's two, I think, key factors for inspiration. One, get in contact with inspired people, and two, engage with inspired utterance of whatever kind, whether it's a film, a book, a movie, a Dharma talk, an image. Of course, in our context, that means Sangha and Dharma. So interesting on this retreat, I don't know if this was part of the logic, we've had a talk on the system of practice, in other words, a talk on Dharma, and Kalyana Mitrata, a talk on Sangha. And when you engage with these, a third factor emerges. So I was talking with, I've been asking people about inspiration because I've been giving, I knew I was going to give this talk. And I was up at Aparajita's place last week, and then I asked him, I said, what do you find inspiring? And he said, when I think about the Buddha, I just want to fall on my knees. And I was really struck by it. Often there's an ironic tone to Aparajita's utterances. But this utterance was totally devoid of irony, which really struck me. I thought, it really kind of, ooh. And I said, why, where did that arise? And he said, something like, I think it's just all the years of practice. It's like things like doing the Tiratna Vandana every day for the last 30 plus years. And that really stayed with me. That, of course, the Buddha is here on the shrine, and there's this really wonderful thing that happens, at a smaller scale when you go on a retreat. What I find is the Buddha kind of comes alive. Like when you come, the Buddha is a statue, the end of the retreat, he's kind of come alive, particularly on a longer retreat, I noticed this. If you remember back to the beginning of the retreat, we entered a mandala. We said in the dedication ceremony, may our mind become Buddha, may our thought become Dharma, may our communication with one another be Sangha. I think maybe it happens the other way round. I think, those three things happen, but I think sequentially often it's more like communication becomes Sangha, thought becomes Dharma. We communicate with each other, we hear Dharma, and then the mind becomes the Buddha. So, of course, the Buddha, like I said earlier, what faith indicates is that we have an affinity with the Buddha. Our mind is made of the same stuff that the Buddha's mind is made from. So when we when we do these things, that the Buddha comes alive, not just as an external thing, but we feel it in ourselves. Our Buddha qualities are kind of stimulated, the resonance is struck up, and we start feeling more like a Buddha. I don't know if you feel like that. I certainly do. I'm not a Buddha at all, but I'm moving in that direction, I think, just from being here with you, doing all this. And of course, I've taught very much in this so far about us exposing ourselves to inspiration. So it's inspiration from our point of view, inspiration for us, communication from our perspective. But for communication to happen, it needs to be a two-way thing. And then that, of course, is what we're concerned with here, isn't it? It's like communicating the Dharma from here outwards, not just from outwards in. And this is one of the amazing things about the Buddha. Vajratara alluded to this last night, that he gained enlightenment and he kept communicating. It seems that there's something about the nature of the awakened mind that needs to communicate. And we're still participating in that. We're still in the Buddha's sasana, the Buddha's ordinance, the Buddha's influence. The Buddha is somehow there. Obviously, he's not physically there, but somehow his compassion is still in operation. It's a kind of a motivating force, and that is an inspiration. We're participating in something together, which is something to do with the Buddha's compassion. Again, it's quite hard to talk about this, but I really wanted to say this. I thought it was really important. It had to be said that if we're going to talk about inspiration, the Buddha is the inspiration. And he's still animating us. He's still animating this thing that we're doing. This comes out, I think, very much, I've talked about entering the mandala. Of course, when you enter into the mandala, you meet the mandala of the five Buddhas. And one of those Buddhas is the Buddha Amoghasiddhi. So some of you will be familiar with this. The Buddha's inner world, the inner dimension of the Buddha's experience is expressed in these five archetypal Buddhas of different colours, which, of course, express those latent aspects of our own Buddha qualities within our own human experience. And Amoghasiddhi is particularly significant in relation to the sense of something which animates a spiritual community. So this is what Lama Govinda says about Amoghasiddhi. So I'll just read this, I'll say a couple of things, and then I'll finish. Amoghasiddhi, this is Lama Govinda talking in Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. Amoghasiddhi represents what we might call the sun at midnight. That is to say, the mysterious activity of spiritual forces which work removed from the senses, invisible and imperceptible, with the aim of guiding the individual, or more properly, all living beings, towards the maturity of knowledge and liberation. The yellow light of an inner sun, Bodhi, invisible to human eyes, interwoven with the deep blue of the night sky, in which the unfathomable space of the universe seems to open itself, form the serene mystic green of Amoghasiddhi. The knowledge of the essential equality and unity of all beings is transformed into the universal spiritualized activity for the benefit of all beings by a complete surrender of self-interest, by the power of all-embracing love and unlimited compassion. These two forces are the indestructible double Vajra of Amoghasiddhi. The double Vajra represents the magic spiritual power of a Buddha in whom the principle of volition is free from all selfish tendencies. On the elementary plane, this all-pervading power corresponds to the element air, the principle of movement and extension of life and breath. So there's something mysterious about green. It's not quite one thing or the other. And Amoga City represents the activity of someone who doesn't have any self-interest. It's kind of baffling. What does that mean? How can you function? How can you do stuff if you've got absolutely no egotism, absolutely no self-interest? Which, of course, is the state of the Buddha. And I think this kind of surrender of self-interest, we get a hint of that, I think, when we do things for others, with other people. I really do think this is what animates our community at its best. Even at its worst, I think. There's something there which is animating us, which is profoundly to do with not just the Dharma, not just the Sangha, but with the Buddha. It's both, there's inspiration and there's expiration, where we're taking in the breath of the Buddha, the wind of the Buddha, in this mandala in which we course, where we're transforming our mind into the Buddha, our thought into Dharma, and our communication into Sangha. So that this metaphor of wind is one that Bhante, towards the end of his life, this poem arose in his mind. You'll know this poem, it's called The Wind. Well, some of you will know it, you might not have come across it, but it's an amazing poem. It's very, very simple. It's old-fashioned, but apparently just arose in his mind all at once. Some of his poems are magic, actually. I think this is one of them. Anyway, I don't want to big it up too much. But this metaphor of wind, that altruism is sort of animated by this force that comes from outside. So anyway, I've talked a lot about inspiration. And I just want to leave you with this poem, and then I'll stop. So, The Wind, by Sangharakshita. A wind was in my sails. It blew stronger and fiercer hour by hour. I did not know from whence it came or why. I only knew its power. Sometimes it dashed me on the rocks. Sometimes it spun me round and round. Sometimes I laughed aloud for joy. Sometimes I felt a peace profound. It drove me on, that manic wind, when I was young. It drives me still, now I am old. It lives in me. Its breath, my breath. Its will, my will.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.